This is episode 9 of the WildFed Podcast, Living with Indigenous Whalers with Bock Clark. For me, this is one of the most impactful interviews I've ever recorded. But first, episode 9 of the WildFed Podcast is brought to you by Surthrival. Surthrival is proud to introduce its new line of technically advanced, organically produced CBD products, CBD3. The line's called CBD3 because it utilizes 3 CBD extracts in one. A powerful, scientifically validated nanoshell CBD that's designed to get into your body fast. A thoroughly researched and scientifically studied liposomal CBD that stays in the body substantially longer than other CBD products, and a traditionally made, balanced, broad-spectrum hemp extract that brings with it all the incredible benefits of the cannabis plant without the THC. CBD3 is studied, lab-tested for purity, and delivers faster results that last longer. It's a full line, so there's a formula with a strength and a price tag to meet your needs. Check out CBD3 at surthrival.com. Hey, would you like to read stories and see photos from my recent wild food adventures, get links to other shows, magazines, or podcasts where I've been featured or interviewed, or see bonus video material from the WildFed TV show? If so, head over to wild-fed.com and join the Subsistence. That's our twice-a-month newsletter. Our subscribers get content that I don't publish anywhere else, so don't miss out. While you're there, check out the WildFed TV show Season 1 trailer and the individual episode teasers. And of course, be sure to check out the WildFed Season 1 experience. That's our 9-week interactive program that begins on January 6th. Doors for that program close on January the 5th, so if you've been wanting to get involved in the wild foods lifestyle in 2020, or to just have the best year of hunting, fishing, and foraging you've ever had, be sure to sign up ASAP. There's already an incredible group of like-minded people who've joined, and we hope you'll join us too. Hey, thanks for all those 5-star ratings and the incredible reviews over at iTunes. Listen, you only have to do this once to move the needle on how the show gets put in front of new listeners. You just go over to iTunes and hit the 5-star rating, assuming you think that we warrant it, and then write up a short but honest review, and you're done. You're done. Anytime you hear me asking, you can think to yourself, I'm all set. I've already given a little back to support Daniel and the WildFed team and their mission. It's instant gratification. And please know, we read all those reviews, and they mean a lot to us. I'm Daniel Vitalis, and you're listening to the WildFed Podcast, a show about reconnecting with nature through hunting, fishing, foraging, and food. WildFed. Food is all around you. As I mentioned earlier, this interview is with Bock Clark. He's a journalist who's not only written for publications like the New York Times Magazine, The Atlantic, National Geographic, GQ, Wired, and Rolling Stone, but he's also the author of The Last Whalers, a book about the time he spent in Indonesia with the Lamalerans, an indigenous group of sea hunters that still subsist on sperm whales and several other species of marine megafauna in the South Pacific. For his field reporting, Doug has personally been on several successful sperm whale hunts, making this a first-hand account of something very few living people have ever or will ever be a part of. Now, maybe it's because of his incredible book, The Last Whalers, which absolutely enthralled me, or maybe it's the content itself, which is at the intersection of anthropology, marine ecology, and wild foods, or maybe it has to do with my interest in whale hunts, especially sperm whale hunts, partially because of their status as the largest carnivore on Earth, and partially because of the incredible but nearly forgotten role that sperm whale hunting played in human history. Or maybe it's just the tone of the interview itself, Doug's imperturbable calm and caring articulation coupled with my reverent appreciation and interest in these whales and the people who subsist on them, but this has to be my favorite interview I've ever conducted. And I don't say that lightly, having interviewed around 200 really incredible people. But for some reason, I've listened to this one over and over again, just drinking in every detail. In fact, I listened to it twice in my hotel room on the day we recorded it, and again on my flight home, plus several times since. So I hope you enjoy it as much as I do. Please go over to the podcast page on wild-fed.com to leave a comment, or to our social media to let us know what you think and how you feel about it. There's lots here to unpack, so I hope you'll pick up a copy of his book or download the audio version, since I think it's really worth your time. His writing and reporting is of the highest caliber. Lastly, episode 10 of the WildFed Podcast will be with my good friend Jim Knutson, who lives down in the Florida Keys. I fish both inshore and offshore with him whenever I visit southern Florida, and he taught me to snare, clean, and cook iguanas, which we feature in episode 4 of the WildFed TV show, so be sure to tune in next Tuesday for a really fun and informative episode. Until then, enjoy episode 9 of the WildFed Podcast, Living with Indigenous Whalers. I'm sitting here with Doug Bock Clark, author of The Last Whalers, 3 Years in the Far Pacific with a Courageous Tribe and a Vanishing Way of Life. Doug, thanks for sitting down with me today.
Well, thanks for having me.
Man, I picked up this book. It jumped off the shelf at me. So I've got this interest in whaling, kind of a perverse interest in whaling. I'm sure that you are now well aware of the political incorrectness of the topic, but I'm fascinated by it. I go to all the whaling museums, New Bedford and Nantucket, and I'm just fascinated by that aspect of human history and of that hunt. This book, the title just grabbed me, and I could not put it down I must have been 3-4 days just from one cover to the other one. So thank you for writing such a beautiful book and capturing such an important piece of history.
Well, thanks for the kind words. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, man. How did this come about for you? Who are you, and how did this come about for you?
Well, I'm a journalist. I write for a number of national publications like the New York Times and the New Yorker and GQ. And I usually write sort of investigative magazine long-form pieces, or the features that you see in the center of magazines. But I knew that when the time came that I could write a book, I wanted to write about this indigenous tribe of hunter-gatherer whalers that I had encountered shortly after I left college when I was living in Indonesia. So when I finally got the opportunity to do a book, I moved back there for a year.
Okay. How far back was that you'd first encountered these folks?
Oh, gosh, it would have been about 8 years ago at this point.
Okay.
I had recently graduated from college. I lived in Indonesia for several years after I graduated from college. And during that time, I was living on a semi-remote island, not as remote of an island as where this group currently lives, but sort of halfway there. And I heard these stories about these people who would, hunt whales with bamboo harpoons and the old way. They would just row out on wooden boats. And when they would get close to the whales, they would run down a diving board stuck on the front of the boat, jump off, and use their body weight to push the bamboo harpoon into the whale. And I thought people were joking with me.
Yeah, it sounds incredible. It can't be real.
Yeah, I thought people were pulling my leg. Some of the people who told me this had a history of doing so.
Okay.
I was fairly new to Indonesia at that point. But when I finally got a break from my job, I was able to just spend several weeks traveling out there. So I would just hop on one bus, like just a sort of a public bus, drive to the end of an island, get on a ferry. Ferry would take me to the next island, and just sort of hopped my way down several hundred miles worth of the island chain until I finally came to this small island called Lembata. And on that island, there's one sort of big modern town on the northern end, and then there's a set of east-west mountains that split the island in half. And on the southern end of that island, there's this tribe. So I got on a dump truck, and I rode in the back of the dump truck up and over the mountains, and I arrived in Lamalera, which is the home of the Lamalerans, or this indigenous whale hunting tribe.
Growing up, did you miss the Save the Whale campaign, or did you grow up at the tail end of that? Do you remember that kind of stuff?
No, I remember it very much, and I have a great deal of sympathy for that campaign.
Of course.
And,
important campaign, obviously.
Of course, yeah. And, a huge amount of just love and admiration for whales themselves. What originally partially drew me to this group was, I think, the dynamic you're alluding to. Like, what does a group like this do in the modern world?
Right.
And then once I got there, I saw that this was an extremely different type of whaling than almost any other that exists in the world. So the Lamalerans are subsistence hunters. Anthropologists have measured sort of the total amount of calories they get from the whaling that they do. And it's the most important part of their diet. Most of the calories they get come in one form or another from the hunt.
Wow.
They take about 20 sperm whales a year, and sperm whales are, the biggest carnivores in the history of the earth. It's not an easy fight. It's not. They're not preying on a defenseless animal.
No.
And even more importantly, there are several 100,000 of these whales left in the wild. The Lamalerans hunt does not impact the global population. They take several dozen a year. And those sperm whales feed all 1,500 of the tribesmen as well as the surrounding tribes.
That they barter and trade with.
That they barter and trade the whale meat with.
I was really surprised when I first... So I grew up in that era of Save the Whales, and it took me... So how much... I guess I actually want to back up a little bit, too, and ask you this. How much context did you have for the industrial whaling era, like the 1500s to the... really up into the 1900s, and the impact that it had, I guess, on, the Industrial Revolution and lighting the world and all that crazy stuff that... I think a lot of people have forgotten. The idea of killing whales is quite, horrific to people, but maybe they don't understand that, like, a lot of the life that they live now came out of the whaling era. Like, had you been aware of that before, or I assume if not, you're well aware of it now?
Well, I would say I'm well aware of it now, but at that time, I was not aware of it. I grew up in the Mountain West. I was not near an ocean.
Right.
I'd read Moby Dick. I was in general aware that that whaling had been an important part of American history, but I hadn't known both broadly how it had contributed to the rise of America and how it had fueled the Industrial Revolution, and even more specifically, I hadn't known that those American whaling ships, long before I got to this island, had actually been hunting the waters, the straits and the seas, just offshore from where I was. This was a central part of where American whalers went.
Yeah.
In the fictional Moby Dick passes very close to it. The Pequod passes very close to this island where they're hunting, and so I had not been aware of all of these sort of paths crossing in time and space.
All that context. Yeah, wow, that's interesting. Were their whaling grounds impacted significantly then by that Western whaling that took place?
It's very hard to tell. So there's no, sort of decent historical records about the whaling. Really only start in the, after World War I. Decent historical records about the Lamalerans whaling.
Okay, right.
Really only start after World War I. And before that, they just have oral histories. So they have, they remember whaling ships. They don't know if they were American or English or, or Dutch or whatnot. But they remember the whalers coming. And they weren't particularly thrilled, but they didn't actually worry about them that much. They're just the Sabu Sea where they live is considered one of the richest, if not the richest, marine ecosystem in the world. And it has a special strait that channels migrations of whales and other marine fauna. And so it's credible to think that they would have still had enough to eat.
Okay.
And not be too worried about it.
Okay, and that would make sense why, we'll get into it later, but I mean, they're able to harvest animals of a size and at a rate that it seems like it would be difficult to do in a lot of other places. So it has to do with the unique ecology of that spot then.
It's very unique. A lot of other whale hunting cultures worldwide do exist, but they don't depend on whaling to the extent that this group does. They might have an annual migration of certain whales in parts of Greenland or Canada, and those hunts at this point are mostly to keep traditions alive. Yep. They're not too much for subsistence. Mm-hmm. But even back in the day, they would subsist for several months a year at most for many of those groups, they'd subsist several months at most on those whales. And then the rest of the time, they'd be hunting other animals.
Okay. So for calorie, not only are they the last sort of hunting and gathering people who are living on whales, but traditionally they would have consumed maybe more whale than a lot of the other cultures like the Inuit that we associate with whaling.
Yes, and their whole culture is built around the whale hunt, whereas, it's hard to make a blanket statement about peoples as diverse as the Inuit.
Yeah.
But their sort of culture and food sources are much broader and is not fully centered on just going after the whales.
Okay.
Whereas the Lamalerans, though seasonal weather does affect when and how they hunt. The Lamalerans are basically hoping to get whales almost the whole year.
Okay. One of the things I really like about the book is how you open it with several maps that kind of start zoomed out and then zoom down in, so we can kind of get a really nice lay of the land of what it looks like geographically there. And you also have like the cast of characters in the beginning too, which is really nice, almost like reading a play, so I can go back and review who the characters are. For people who haven't seen the book yet, can you kind of set the stage a little bit about what this place is like geographically, geologically, topographically? What's the climate like? What is it like to be there?
So Lamaler is located on a small island on the far end of the Indonesian archipelago, which is the chain of islands that come off the bottom of Southeast Asia and end right above Australia. So it's north of Australia and, far east, 1,500, 2,000 miles east of mainland Asia. And it's a beautiful, beautiful, gorgeous volcanic island. Their small village sits at the foot of maybe a 6,000 foot volcano.
Active or no?
Active.
Yeah.
That rises up, literally right behind their village.
Cool. Okay.
And their village overlooks this, as I mentioned before, this special deep water strait, where if you're on the cliffs on which the village is perched, you have a perfect view out over the sea and everything that's going to be swimming within 20 or 30 miles.
Your eyes kind of twinkle when you talk about it, man.
I have good memories.
Good memories, right? Yeah. And you had mentioned something in the book about how it's the Lamalerans. Am I saying it right?
Correct.
Okay, so you mentioned in the book that for the Lamalerans, the idea of bare earth in your front yard is sort of the equivalent to us being like, oh, you have a very lush green lawn. So is it arid? Is it dry, dusty? What's it like there? Does it have a rain season and a dry season?
Yeah, so it has a monsoon season and a hot season.
Okay.
And they live on sort of a unique peninsula where the streams from the mountain, from the volcano behind them, do not end up on their territory. They end up on the territory of other tribes. So they don't have great year-round water sources. They have, at this point, dug a few wells that run quite low in the dry season and sometimes dry up altogether. But because of this, they can't really do agriculture. They're just up on a mountainside. It's very rocky earth, with sort of loose iron-rich soil over, volcanic bedrock.
Yeah.
And so because of that, they basically hunt for their living. They don't really have a great option in order to grow food to eat, which is partially why their culture evolved this way.
And do we have any sense of how long they've been there and how old their culture is? I guess reading the book, you tell some of the story of how they came to be there. And that part of the book for me felt like it was mythology woven with history, and I really liked that aspect of it. So I know it's my very Western mind that wants to know, but do we have a sense of how long they've been there, how old this culture is?
They've probably been in that village itself for about 500 years, okay. Give or take. As I note before, there's a lot of oral history from both from their tradition and the traditions of neighboring tribes. And the events in that history, some of them are peggable to events which we know the dates of, whether it's a volcanic eruption or when the Dutch arrived for colonial efforts in Indonesia and so on and so forth. You can sort of line up certain events in their history with dates. And they were probably spear hunting marine animals prior to coming to this location. But a tsunami wiped out their old home and sent them on basically an odyssey where they ended up where they are about 500 years ago.
But that was already their way of life, as they were like a seafaring people.
Yeah, they were it's unclear whether or not how much they were hunting sperm whales, but they were certainly hunting smaller animals at that point.
And how do they live? Like, what are their homes like?
So the village itself would not look all that different from that of a village in most developing countries today. The common denominator of cheap and durable resources means that whether you're in parts of Asia or Africa or other places that I've reported from, it's usually cinder block, cement, walls with corrugated metal roofing on top.
Yep.
there's some physical differences in that you'll see giant stacks of whale bones on the beach, but the actual physical town itself at this point is very easy to imagine.
Yeah. Okay. So a lot like so much of the world. One of the things that really is interesting to me in my study of hunter-gatherer peoples, so often they're migratory, and that they need to move from place to place throughout the year in order to follow food. And there's only certain places in the world that were food rich enough for people to be sedentary in the kind of way that it seems like they are there. And so I guess that would be in part because of the rich hunting grounds, but I assume also because of trade that they're able to do, because you're saying they can't grow crops. And I'm wondering, do they, for the plants that they eat, do they forage anything from the landscape where they are, or are they exclusively trading with agriculturalists inland?
So they forage a little bit on their territory and sort of this fringing territory. But mostly what they do is they barter with other tribes. So they live down on the coast, and above them up in the mountains, where there is significantly more rain and significantly more water, there are a bunch of tribes that historically have just grown crops. They haven't really done that much herding. They haven't really done that much hunting. What they've done instead is specialized in growing corn and types of rice and types of banana, which the Lamalerans can't. And then the two groups exchange carbohydrates for protein.
Yeah.
And so because of that, a very unique ancient barter economy has developed, which still continues to this day.
Okay, because you described some marketplaces. Is that kind of where a lot of that's taking place?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And do they have, or did they traditionally have inside the village? Is it like a reciprocal gift economy essentially? Do they barter within the community itself, or are they largely gift giving with the expectation of returns when they are in need?
So for the most part, they don't actually use cash. You know, some outside Indonesian money now has come in,
of course, yeah.
But still, for the most part, it's basically reciprocal gift giving. It's
really cool.
Reciprocal altruism, and what one hunter may catch one day, he then will share out with the community. And because they're so dependent on sharing out their catches, if you're a hunter and you hunting group clan, there are 20 clans in sort of the overall tribe, and you only catch 1 or 2 whales a year, you need to share that whale out to make sure that you have even returns at all points. Someone's going to be catching a whale every month or every few weeks, but if that group isn't sharing, that group will eat, everyone else will starve. So instead, the culture has evolved in order to make sure that everyone is constantly sharing out their food.
And everybody must know at some point you're the one who's not catching and in need as well, right? So
it's very clear,
yeah.
and people aren't afraid to ask either. There's not
when they're in need.
When they're in need,
yeah.
There's a little bit. Everyone wants to be the guy that catches the whale, but it's also sharing is so deeply ingrained and so expected that it's not. This American ideal of being an isolate or a cowboy, this sort of free agent, is not held up as the ideal there. It's really just about your relationship with the tribe.
Yeah.
And so there's no shame in asking for help from your compatriots.
How were you received into the village, and what was it like to bring, such a different background and I guess cultural paradigm with you, and then finding yourself there? Because you've spent how much time with them now?
Little more than a year at this point, spread out over several years. So the first time that I went there, give or take 8 years ago, they were just incredibly hospitable. They loved that I could already speak Indonesian. It's not many people who go there who can directly communicate with them, and they're very proud of their way of life, and so they were more than happy to show me what they were doing. And then as I came back, several years later, and just started spending months and months at a time with them, I feel extraordinarily thankful and grateful to them for the ability to just share in their life and go on the hunts with them every morning, go help gather firewood, help with the butchering. As a journalist, I was not trying to hold myself above or apart, but just to truly
participate
as much as I could.
How are you with seasickness?
I'm terrible.
What's for people like that? How common is that, and how do they see that?
They thought it was hilarious. There is one time early in my tenure there when I the seas were quite rough and I ended up throwing up, and then shortly thereafter a whale appeared, and so they started making this joke that I had baited the whale to come the way you'd bait a fish. And so whenever we were going through a dry spell, they'd say, we need you to bait the fishes, Doug.
So, I want to get into sort of what the hunt looks like, but I want to set the stage, too, with a little bit of the language. I love the glossary in the book, and I love the language, the parts of their language, which I assume are not Indonesian, but are unique to their culture.
Yes, so they speak both Indonesian, which is the national language, which all of the many, many different linguistic groups in that nation speak. But they also speak their own language called Lamalerans, which is spoken by a very small number of people in the world, just centered around that island and the surrounding islands.
Has that been codified and written down, or does it just exist within their community at this point?
Their dialect of Lamalerans has had a small amount of tangential study by anthropologists who were doing work focused on other things there. But no one has ever, I would love for someone to do a full linguistics study, to have a true professional do it. I was lucky enough to be able to access the writings of the anthropologists, as well as one Lamaleran who actually went on to become a priest, and as sort of his dissertation for becoming a priest wrote a grammar for the for the language. So it's relatively short. It doesn't have a dictionary. It doesn't have the full set of resources that most that would be considered a full study of a language. But it was enough for me to be able to understand the grammar and then sort of build my own dictionary and so on and so forth. Okay,
so you over time were you able to communicate with them in that tongue as opposed to just strictly Indonesian, or was it a hybridization? And are they speaking a hybridization as well?
They do speak a hybridization as well. They would speak mostly Lamalerans among themselves, but at this point Indonesian has become so prevalent that it's mixed into everyday speech. And I got fairly good at Lamalerans, which was a real joy. It was a real pleasure and something that I tried very hard to master.
So the first word I wanted to talk about was baleo. Is that the pronunciation?
Baleo.
Yeah. And it means?
It means literally it means bring the ropes.
Oh, okay.
But what it basically means is the whales have come.
Okay. And it bears no connection then to the word baleen, and because so many of the Latin languages share, the word for whale has the same sort of, looks like the same root word, but this is
none at all.
No relationship. That's so interesting.
So it literally means bring the ropes, because it means go grab the harpoon ropes, get the gear, yeah. let's go hunting. But colloquially at this point it just means the whales are here, and time to go get them.
And that might be, you sort of in the book, it sounds like that's something that will spread throughout the village. So whoever just is the first to spot starts shouting, and then people just pick it up and pass it along, or.
Yeah, so there's not really a telephone system or anything in the village. So what happens is someone on one of the cliffs usually, or down on the beach, will be looking out to sea and just sort of keeping an eye on the horizon, and they'll see a whale spout. And then they'll shout, baleo, and someone else will hear it, and they'll shout baleo, and then more people will hear it. And sort of like a great game of telephone, it will spread, the village itself is maybe a mile wide, and, probably goes a similar distance up the mountain, and you'll just sort of hear it ricochet between all the houses up the volcano.
No false alarms ever?
Rarely. If you're the one who starts the false alarm, you're gonna get a lot of people will know.
Yeah, right. And then Lamafa.
So the Lamafa are the harpooners who stand at the front of the boat and jump off that diving board and use their body weight to spear the whale. And they're sort of both the physical leaders as well as the spiritual leaders of their whaling ship.
Okay. And is there maybe a Western equivalent to the status that person would hold that you can have thought of? That is it like you're the quarterback? Is it like, is there some kind of equivalent for people to understand like the role that person, or maybe the desire that some of the younger men would have to work their way into that role?
Quarterback would be a good comparison in the sense that, for the quarterback runs the whole team. He's involved in every play. Other people do other things on the field at that point, but he's the one who controls everything, who takes on the most important role. And so I think that would be a fair comparison.
What would be like the age range of somebody who would do that job?
The youngest people are in their late teens. There's several every generation who are considered, true prodigies, and who might get to pick up their spears in the late, in their when they're 18 or 19. But most people most of them have to sort of earn it slowly by the time they're 30 or so, and then they can keep the spears as long as they are producing. Okay. People. In
other words, keep that job.
Yeah. Technically, it's a position for life once they're given it to them. But if too long goes by without them catching food, people need to eat. So, they may be pressured, or someone else may sort of unofficially step in.
There was times in the book where you get the impression that it's a pretty high-pressure role to play.
Oh, it's extremely high pressure.
If you make mistakes, all eyes are on you. Huh? I mean, it's subsistence, right?
Yeah.
So,
if you don't, it's talking to the Lamafa themselves. They feel a great amount of pressure. They're literally up at the front of the boat with, a dozen men behind them who've all been rowing or handling the ropes for them. And, all of those people's efforts depend on their ability to correctly land the spear. Okay. And even though a whale is a big target, it's actually extraordinarily hard to do. It's moving in the water. Their blubber can be a foot thick. You really have to get it deep in there. Otherwise, the whale's thrashing is going to dislodge it. Or, if you just hit it slightly the wrong angle, it's going to bounce off. And that's not even talking about, smaller, quicker animals like sharks, right, which are extraordinarily hard to hit.
Right. And do you have folks in the boat sometimes who would like to be in that position? They're behind you, kind of watching you from the back.
Oh yes. So there's, the young. Everyone wants to be the Lamafa. It's the equivalent of, as you said, the quarterback, or being the all-star in the tribe.
Yeah.
So all the young men are sort of constantly striving to prove themselves, to get better at harpooning. And there's sort of a hierarchy on the boat, but the person one down from the Lamafa is considered his apprentice or his friend. Is called the Berung Alep, and that's traditionally the position that a promising young harpooner, who's sort of being trained up with the eye to maybe one day becoming a Lamafa himself, will get to do. And so in my book, I follow the story of a young man named John who has grown up wanting to be a Lamafa. That's been his whole dream, especially because he was born in somewhat unique circumstances. His mother was a Lamaleran, but his father was one of the mountain tribesmen from the agricultural societies up in the mountains, and he has been teased his whole life about not being a true Lamaleran. So he grew up thinking, I'll become a Lamafa and I'll prove them all wrong. But the book opens with a hunt going disastrously wrong. So he's up there at the front of the boat. He's not the full Berung Alep, but he's sort of insinuated himself into the spot behind that guy. And when the Lamafa makes a mistake and doesn't manage to land his harpoon, or when the Lamafal does manage to land his harpoon and John tries to help, he ends up getting hurt by a wayward harpoon rope, and his leg is very, very gravely injured. And so all of a sudden it's unclear whether or not he'll ever be able to hunt again. And so over the course of 3 years, I followed him as he regained his strength and as he trained to become a Lamafa, and eventually, well, I guess you'll have to read the book to find out what happens eventually.
These boats that they're in, and are they called tena? I'll let you pronounce for me.
They're called tena.
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 The tena are remarkably similar in certain regards to Western whaling boats, that they would launch from the ships. I assume that's like convergent evolution, that it's just that's the type of and size and shape of boat that works well. I mean, they didn't draw from other whaling cultures' influences? These are what they've developed?
No,
right?
And they were certainly using tena far before Western whalers arrived in Indonesia.
And do they have, one of the things that looks different to me is that the Western whale boats would have, I forget what they called it, but like a pedestal in the boat that they would wrap the lines around and use essentially as a brake, like a friction brake to slow the whale down, like the drag on a fishing reel. And I didn't see anything like that or read anything like that. So are they just purely attached to that whale and they have no brake?
Yeah, they have. There's no drogue. There's no. It's just the rope runs from the front of the boat through several other ropes which keep it sort of aligned in the center of the boat, and then attaches to some very thick pieces of wood on the keel so it can't be ripped off.
Are the lines a constant danger? I mean, I assume you played sometimes you were in the boat. I assume not necessarily doing a specific role.
Oh no, I tried to. That was one place where I would participate in the sense that I would be there, but I was purely an observer during the whale hunts themselves.
So you must have had to be very mindful of those lines when they're paying out a little bit.
The lines, so the hunting itself is extremely dangerous. Hunters are hurt all the time, are killed, much more often than one would hope. And the ropes are probably the most dangerous thing, because when you attach a rope to a 60-ton animal fighting for its life, and it's on a relatively small craft, and it's once it gets loose, it's a real danger.
My goodness, I would like to talk. I'm getting closer to what I want to talk about the hunt itself, but a few more words I wanted to talk about. Uma
is a portion, almost like a corporate share, like a share of a corporation that each Lamaleran has. So it's the portion of the when a whale comes in, it's not the one man who stabbed it that gets it. It gets divided among all the people who own the Uma. And then the people who own the Uma further divide it among friends and family to make sure everyone gets it. But it's sort of the physical representation of being part of the tribe.
Okay. And so different individuals will have, or different families will have a larger or smaller portion depending on what kind of factors?
Basically the role that they play in the hunt. Some people can get multiple Uma for sort of doing multiple jobs. So a man, one of the men I profile is both a shaman and a shipbuilder and sort of the captain of his own ship. So he handles sort of the mystic role, the role of the spiritual leader of the ship. He literally makes it and fixes it when it breaks. And then he also is the captain. So he sort of gets a triple Uma. He gets 3 of them, whereas most people usually just get 1 or 2.
Okay. And there was a couple other words associated with that too. Is it Bifana?
Bifuna.
Tell us about that.
And so that's sharing out. That's how the Uma shares that are given directly from the people who have caught the whale are spread out in Bifuna shares to the people who did not directly help catch the whale. And so it's basically charity, but charity doesn't fully capture the level of generosity and of everydayness that's going on in this process. So one thing that anthropologists have always been fascinated with about the Lamalerans is that they're an extremely generous culture. They share resources, they share most of their possessions in a very communal way. And anthropologists can actually rate this sort of thing. They have various games and methods where they'll show up with a group and they, have people take basically tests. And the Lamalerans score extraordinarily high on that test. Arguably they score the highest.
In generosity.
In generosity and sort of what they do when you give them resources. But it's baked into the
culture. Do they see themselves as trying to be generous, or is it a bit of that? Is it just that it's
they do see themselves as being generous, but it's also just the cultural norm, and that norm is really represented in the bufuna. It's really because everyone is supposed to share out their personal uma. It just becomes normalized from childhood that when you're given something or when you get a resource, what you're going to do with it is keep enough for yourself to live and enough for your family to eat for, a week or two. But you're then going to make sure that you give the rest to everyone who didn't get some. And so that practice of giving is just so deeply ingrained in the culture that if you give the Lamalerans a pot of money, they'll give away more of it than they'll keep. Okay. If an anthropologist were to give one of us a pot of money or a Western industrialized citizen, and these experiments have been done many, many times, we're much more likely to keep more for ourselves than we are to give away to other people. Of course.
Do you remember, I'm sure you do, the first time you heard Baleo shouted out?
I do, yeah. It was on my first visit there 8 years or so ago.
What was it like?
Oh, it was so exciting. It was. I was quite far away from the beach where they launch all the boats. I was actually at one of the markets where they were trading the meat for with the mountain tribes for vegetables, and I had to just run, physically sprint with all the other men, back quite a ways, a mile or more, to get there, and then. We launched, and you could see.
You went with them.
Yeah.
Wow.
And you could see the spout on the horizon. Whales are fortunately fairly easy to keep track of. Yeah. And so once everyone gets to the beach, there's about a dozen tainas for the whole tribe, and each person knows which taina they're going to go with, and they push the taina out into the water.
They're all crews.
They're all basically crews. The crews are a little bit flexible, but they launch the ships, and then you just...
And they're about how long, these boats?
35 feet or so.
Okay, so they're pretty big, actually.
They're pretty big. They're much more like... They're significantly bigger than American whaling boats. Yeah. And they're not particularly hydrodynamic. They're much more like tanks or something. They're just built to withstand damage. Really sturdy. They have a set of inner thwarts, like a double layer of inner thwarts, so it has basically a second skeleton that most boats would not have.
And these boats have been patterned upon the original or the ancient design, right? There's like some taboo against varying the design of these boats.
Yeah, so they're probably the last, large-scale lashed lug boats that are manufactured in the world, which is this very unique design. That doesn't use metal, it doesn't use screws or nails. It just uses basically ropes and very, very careful dovetailing so that all of the boards of the boat just sort of socket together.
Each boat has to be custom fit.
Each board is custom fit. And they're incredible pieces of engineering. And the goal is literally not to make anything new or anything different for each time they have to rebuild the boat. So the idea is that each of these ships is exactly the same as the original ship that they arrived in Lamalera on.
And they are like a spiritual embodiment of beingness. No, they're sort of anthropomorphized, these boats.
Yeah, they're considered living spiritual beings that are part of the clan. The Lamalerans have personal relationships with them. When one's damaged in battle, it's like losing a brother or something.
Wow. So here you are, you're running down with everyone to the beach this first time. What happens?
And so then everyone's racing, everyone wants to be the first one out. You hop in the boat, and then you start chasing. And that first hunt, unfortunately, we did not catch the whale, and it dove before we got there. We were probably about half a mile away.
Very deep diving whales, sperm whales.
Very deep diving. They can hold their breath for very significant amounts of time. So if it gets a good set of breaths and goes down, there's not a guarantee you're going to be able to find it again.
Now, their weakness, if I understand it, is that they must come up after that and sort of spend some time breathing back up at the surface, and that's when they're more vulnerable to...
Right, and they also telegraph where they're going to go. So there's an old whaling rule, which was used by the American whalers and the Dutch and the Lamalerans, and it's essentially the exact same for all of them, which is that before a whale dives, it will take one breath for each spout that it sends up. And each one of those is worth several minutes. And then it will dive in the direction opposite that its flukes point when it dives. So you can guesstimate where that whale is going to resurface when it goes down. So once a whale does dive, it becomes like a game of whack-a-mole. You basically try and guess where it's going, about how fast it was moving, and what direction it went, and how long it will be underwater. And then you go and you park yourself there and hope it comes up. And it works a surprising amount of the time.
How close did you get to that first whale?
The seas were fairly rough that day, and we just never saw it come back up. But, on the many successful hunts that I've participated in since, which would, number in the low dozens.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, my goodness. Yeah, okay. Tell me about the first time that you were... Now, one of the things I learned about the Western whalers was that the people rowing the boat would be facing away from the whale. So the harpooner's facing forward, and none of the rowers are allowed to really turn around and look because of how frightened they could become of the whale, is at least what I was told. This is different, right? So what was it like for you the first time? I mean, this is such a gigantic animal, right? And I'm just curious. You're the first person I've sat with who's experienced this hunt.
I mean, it feels like a life or death moment.
Hey, we'll get right back to the show, but I wanted to take a moment to tell you how you can see Season 1 of WildFed. If you head over to wild-fed.com right now, you'll see that pre-orders for Season 1 are available alongside the Season 1 experience. Both will begin on January 6th of 2020. If you choose the show on its own, you'll get access to a new episode every week for 8 weeks. Remember, these are 30-minute episodes, not the 22 minutes of a typical TV show. If you choose the program, it'll include Season 1, but each week, along with a new episode, you'll receive a director's cut, where our producer Grant Giuliano and I break down the episode, discussing the background, the gear we use, the places and people and stories involved, as well as some of the comedy that took place on the side, some of the drama, some of the intrigue that we couldn't squeeze into the 30-minute format. You'll also get exclusive access to a weekly live Q&A, where we'll be answering your questions and discussing how you can get started hunting, fishing, and foraging for food. Additionally, this will all take place inside of a private member group, where you'll have access to me and the WildFed team for a full 9 weeks, as well as a community of like-minded folks. If you just want to see the show on its own, it's $49. If you want to join me in the 9-week program, that's just $249. Go over to wild-fed.com to get the show or sign up for the program. Now, here's the rest of the podcast.
It feels with all the gravity and tension and seriousness that entails. It's also extremely nerve-wracking because as you approach closer and closer, the whale may start to try to avoid you, or it may dive, or it may just try to outpace you. So it's not like it happens all at once. Approaching a whale is usually a process of tens of minutes, 15 minutes, 20 minutes, 30 minutes, until you finally get close enough. And the Lamafa is at the front of the boat on that diving platform pretty much the whole time. And he will have a very, very long spear, anywhere between 16 and 20 feet, just poised, ready to go the moment that the whale gets close enough.
Now this is bamboo with a removable harpoon head that must be attached to the rope.
Correct. It's a piece of iron that they actually forge in the village. They still use bamboo bellows and a hammer.
And is it like a set of golf clubs, and that he's like, I'm going to use this one in this instant? How many would they have on the boat, and how are they selected for use?
So they can have anywhere up to a dozen. Most will have 7 or 8 different harpoons. For a whale, there's really only one harpoon, which is just the biggest and thickest and strongest one that they have. Because the harpoons will often shatter when you hit the animal with them. But there are the Lamalerans will hunt essentially any marine mammal that they can see and spear. So there are plenty of other harpoons, lighter for throwing, if they were trying to catch devil rays or dolphins.
Even orcas, you mentioned.
Even
orcas.
Which
are, of course, the largest of the dolphins. But the dolphins being toothed whales as well, cetaceans. Yeah. I mean, that's a large and seems like a very dangerous animal to contend with as well.
Yeah. The orcas are quite dangerous. They're very fast. They're faster than sperm whales. They're huge. I mean, they're huge animals. The ones that I've seen were probably in the 25 to 30 foot range. But a sperm whale is probably twice as long and it's just more massive, maybe 3 times as heavy. Its body is not as streamlined and it's just big. And
like a school bus, or
yeah, think a school bus. The big ones seem considerably bigger than school buses.
Yeah.
Whereas the orca is give or take the same size as the hunting boats.
Okay.
So whereas the sperm whales will often flip the hunting boats, and just when they start going at it with the tail, the boats will just be spun around and thrown in every which way. Which is why the boats are built basically just to be tanks. They're just meant to be indestructible.
Because they do take the brunt of these
They
attacks.
just have to take hours worth of damage from the whale. You can't. What happens once the harpooner lands the harpoon and it's connected to the boat is you can't land a killing blow against an animal this big. It's really death by 1,000 needle pricks.
Yeah.
And so it becomes an hours long, anywhere from 2 or 3 hours to, I've been on ones that must have been 8 or something.
Wow.
Where they just sort of keep needling it and try and exhaust it, and they try and keep hitting the same point to create
an opening.
Opening that they can then
into the lungs, into the heart. The lungs must sit pretty high up by the blowhole there.
Usually into the internal organs.
Okay.
So usually they'll just sort of keep hitting the same spot, and then once it's been bleeding out for hours, some of the men will get in the water with knives, very specialized long knives, which have maybe a 2-foot long blade, and swim beside it. And they're too small, and the whale at that point will be too weak to be able to go after them. They can just sort of keep right up on its side, and it's really only dangerous at its front and its back with its tail and its mouth. And so as long as they keep on
it can do damage then with its mouth.
It can.
I see a lot of these, old images, which I assume from the whaling days, which I assume are hyperbole, where you see, because they have such a strange jaw, the sperm whale, right? That's really optimized for, I assume, for squid. But that very long, narrow jaw. What will they get a person in there, or a limb, or?
Yeah, if you, it's harder, I think, for them. The tail is more dangerous than the jaw.
Okay.
But they do something which is called jaw backing, which you'll see pictures of old American whalers or old American paintings of this, where because the whale's jaw is on its bottom. So imagine just a giant tube with a trap door of a mouth coming out directly from its bottom. It will roll onto its back, so its jaw is now sticking up above the surface, and it will start trying to bite through the boat or bite through anyone who's up there. And so, at least in the old American paintings, you'll just see them crushing boats with their
that's
jaws.
what I'm talking about. I see a lot of those pictures, and I thought that they were maybe sensationalized, but that is a thing that happens.
I have seen them jaw back. I have never seen them successfully eat their way through a boat.
Okay, yeah. But still, I mean, those teeth are gigantic, right? I mean, they must be, 7-8 inches long, and...
Yeah, and the jaws the jaws could conceivably go through a small whaling boat, in my opinion.
Wow.
But the Lamaleran whaling boats are just so big, and again, they have this
robust.
sort of double internal skeletons.
I guess you're sort of touching on it now, and this is a question I have wanted to ask somebody for the longest time, and I have tried asking it at a few of the museums that I've been to, but, obviously I'm talking to tour guides, and they haven't been there for it, but how conscientiously... how aware is the whale of the individuals and of the boat, and do you get the sense that it is strategically fighting back versus just flailing? Like, is it strategically going after the pain point or after the boat itself? How much do you get the sense the whale understands intelligently how to sort of fight its way through this?
I think the whales are very, very smart, which is part of what makes watching one of these hunts so hard. They're, I can't say whether it's aware of, each individual human's, also being another living being and so on and so forth. But they're very aware of, especially once they've been struck, that they are being targeted and that they're in mortal danger. And when a pod of whales is attacked, they're very aware that their family members or their children or their parents are in mortal danger. And so they have various strategies, evolved to deal with other types of animals that they employ, but which work fairly well against the Lamalerans too. One of the things they do is they put all of their heads together. A pod will all put their foreheads together so that their tails stick out in sort of a 360-degree circle.
No way, really?
Yeah.
They circle the wagons.
They circle the wagons, and it's very... If they have a full pod of whales, you can't really get in. You can't really attack that because you'll just get smashed.
Those flukes are just so damaging.
But it's very hard to get, 6 or 8 whales together. And so if they only have 3 or 4, there's often a weak point which someone can, go and land a harpoon. And once, one's bleeding, it starts weakening and, a crack in the armor has developed.
Do the other whales, at what point will they abandon that whale?
It depends. The young men will abandon each other pretty quick. They don't... this isn't always the case, and sperm whales are social animals. They have a sense of being. They know how to. They have what are what scientists call marks of selfhood. They can recognize themselves in the equivalent of mirrors. They can. They have basically a language. They send out these sonic clicks, and each one of them has a unique click that identifies itself, which would be the equivalent of a name.
And very developed limbic systems in their brain, as I understand, right? So for socially and emotionally...
equivalent structures to human brain structures. And so, it's can be quite tragic to watch a whole pod be attacked. The one thing that the Lamalerans know that the whales are very smart. They regard them as gifts sent by their ancestors. They believe that they're spiritual embodiments of dead Lamalerans who are coming back to give themselves as food to the hunters as a reward for following the ancestors' way. And so for them, it's a spiritual thing for which they're extremely grateful and for which they take extremely seriously when a whale does give its life to them. For an environmentalist or someone with a conservationist point of view, I think it would be extremely hard to watch one of these hunts.
Yeah. Oh, I'd imagine, I mean, as a hunter, it can be hard sometimes, with animals that you can feel a kinship with, particularly mammals. And have you ever been able to make eye contact with a living sperm whale?
Yes.
Anything that you would say about that?
I believe that they're intelligent, sentient beings, and it's always hard to watch an intelligent, sentient being die.
Mm-hmm.
Even though, as I obviously make clear in the book, I believe that if there is an ethical type of whaling, it's the Lamalerans.
Yeah. And they're certain, obviously they're practicing something that ends up being, what's the term they use in biology management? It's like non-additive mortality, right? Like the number that they're taking is less than how many are reproduce every year. So I know they're not impacting, but it's like you have that dynamic between caring about the species and caring about the individual members of the species. I feel like sometimes animal rights activists are very focused on the individuals of a species, and then the conservationists tend to focus more on the species, and obviously both have merit. But regardless, I just imagine that it's challenging to watch. What are the moments after the animal dies? What are those moments like? What happens in those moments? And there must be tremendous blood in the water.
Oh, tremendous.
Does it attract other predators?
In days past, it would attract swarms of sharks. That is happening less as Taiwanese and Thai longliners come in and basically strip mine the Sabu Sea.
They're finning.
Yeah, and so sharks do come, but less often now. And what really happens is that it's a moment of thanks for the Lamalerans.
Mm-hmm.
They will say a prayer or have a moment of silence to accept their ancestor back in with them, and it's a sign for them of spiritual balance with the universe. So they have a very unique religion. They still practice a unique form of animism that's been mixed with Catholicism, which missionaries brought at a later point. But they believe that their ancestors are constantly with them, the past whalers and, the other past Lamalerans. And that when they are following what are called the laws of the ancestors or the ways of the ancestors, they're rewarded by being given the whales. When they're failing to follow these laws, they don't get anything to eat. And that's a sign that something is spiritually out of whack in the community. And so when a whale is caught, not only is it physical sustenance for them, but it's also spiritual sustenance. It's a sign that that they have done well, and that they, and for that they're extremely grateful.
And then all the work is done at shore? Is any processing take place in the water, or is it, and do just all the boats then start towing the whale back? I mean, and the drag, I just can't imagine. I guess they're neutrally buoyant in the water, but I imagine the drag of pulling those whales back to shore must be immense.
So the only real processing that happens is the Lamafa will dive into the water with the whale, and he'll tie the whale's mouth shut, the jaw shut,
so
that it doesn't take on water.
Okay, they will sink. What do they do that with?
Just rope.
Around
the head.
They have such an unusual head, the sperm whale, right?
Yeah.
The squareness of their head is so unique. Okay.
I've been in the water when it's happening, and the time that I was had a good enough vantage to be able to sort of dive down and watch, they basically just tie a rope around the end of the mouth, run it up above water, and then they poke holes in its fins to run the rope through as sort of a way to make sure that they have secure attachments to the boat.
I saw a photo of you today. I don't believe it's in the book, but I saw it in an article that you had written of you in the water, and there's a whale just sort of. It's quite a beautiful photo because you really have to know that whale's there to see it, and then when you see it, you realize you're seeing the jaw and the head of that whale. behind you. I don't know, do you have like a selfie stick or something?
No,
'Cause the photo credit is of you. It's you, but then it says that you took the photo.
Oh, I did not. I did not hit the click button.
Yeah.
A friend
Anyway,
did
incredible
that.
photo. So you've been in the water with these whales as well. I mean, I imagine just it must be a bit surreal, the scale of them.
It is. They're gigantic.
Yeah.
There's they're bigger than dinosaurs.
What's the biggest one you've seen?
Give or take 70 feet.
What do you think it weighed?
Usually the rule of thumb is for each foot they weigh about a ton, so about 70 tons.
Oh my goodness! So then it's just paddle it back to shore.
Yeah. So they also have the Tena, which are the ancient hunting boats, which still have to be built according to the old specifications, which are still only allowed to be rowed, and they have palm leaf sails. But they also have smaller, basically support craft, which are called Johnson, which are named after Johnson Outboard Motors, which is an American company.
I love this part of the story because it made me think of Castaway and the ball that Tom Hanks is with. He calls Wilson, right?
Yeah.
It's the brand name.
They don't. They just know that the word Johnson is on the side of these motors, and so that's what they've called all motors since once they started acquiring these.
Okay.
But they will often then attach those smaller boats to that whale and
there's
help
like a
bring
bit of
it
a
in.
prohibition on using the motored boats for the actual kill.
Yes. So, so one of the things that has been happening over the last decade and a half has been that the Lamalerans have increasingly encountered the outside world. Mm-hmm. So they've known about outboard motors, since at least the 1970s. The UN Food and Agricultural Commission tried to give them motors, and they refused. They said, this breaks the laws of the ancestors. We're not going to do this. But by give or take, the turn of the millennium, 2000 or so, they were starting to see that the motors could be useful. And, so maybe we'll have a few in town. We won't use them to hunt the whales, but, we have an elderly priest here who, goes out and ministers to these other villages. It's not great for him to be walking over these tough footpaths. We'll just use it to run him down the coast. It'd be super easy. But then they realize while they're doing that, we can catch, a young Lamafa was bringing the priest somewhere, and look, there's some good devil rays over there. And so they realized that, they could hunt smaller animals using these boats. And once they realized they could do that, it became complicated how much more types of hunting they could do. And so every year they get together, what's called the Tobu Namafata, which is the council on the beach, and they discuss what the rules for the upcoming year would be. And so some of the younger hunters began to say, we should really start using these outboard motors for hunting. They're extremely useful. It helps us catch, certain types of animals we haven't been able to catch before.
Like what?
Swordfish, for example. Mm-hmm. They can actually run down
fast pelagic swimmers.
Tuna.
Yeah.
I haven't personally seen them hit a tuna, but I've seen them bring tuna back to shore. Types of sharks. They're useful for catching orcas as well. But they created this great debate in the community. Are we violating the laws of the ancestors by using these for hunting? What can and can't we do? Can we use it for sperm whales? Can we not? And so it was eventually decided that you cannot use them for sperm whales. These are the gifts of the ancestors. This would be violating the laws of the ancestors. But you can use them for anything else. And then once that happens, give or take a few years go by, and then someone figures out, would it be breaking the rule if I attached a rope from this small boat, this support craft, to a Tena, and then pulled the Tena to, in the general vicinity of the whale.
Get out there faster.
And then let go. And then, drove away on my motorboat and let the guys row the last, few hundred yards or so. And a huge discussion happened about that again. And as happened with the other things, at the beginning, the conservatives were very dead set against this. But, sort of over time, as they've gotten older and there have been fewer of them, now, the younger generation has established these practices. So the sperm whale hunt is still done at its end stage. At the very end, it's just men rowing. It's just men using bamboo spears exactly as it's been for hundreds of years, because that is the laws of the ancestors.
Okay.
But you can see the tribe trying to figure out what's legal according to these laws of the ancestors and innovating within it. And in a lot of ways, that's what the book is about. It's about a group that's, facing the challenges of the modern world and trying to figure out, how do we want to engage with this? What do we think is good about the modern world? And what do we think is good about our own, ancient way of life, and trying to get the best of both worlds?
That I want to kind of come back to all of that, because I feel like that is a really important part of the book, and it's kind of what you're left with after you read it. There's not an easy answer to this from the outside. I can't imagine from the inside. I mean, it's like something you really wrestle with, and it's interesting when you think of conservatism in that regard versus conservatism in our modern culture here, and liberalism there versus liberalism here, and it's very obvious looking at those cultures that both sides have important merits, and should be voiced at the beach. So I find that really interesting. I want to come back to that. But once they have towed this whale back to the beach, what happens?
So then they have to cut it up.
Do they leave the intestinal tract inside the animal?
No, they will generally pull the, open up the animal and sort of reel it out hand over fist. They'll literally cut a hole into the side, and then a guy will basically go splunking.
Start pulling everything out.
He'll just stick his whole body in.
Is there any use for any of it?
All of it.
Wow.
There's almost literally no part of the sperm whale that they don't use, whether the internal soft organs are eaten, almost immediately, or cooked into these big stews, whereas the meat itself is usually smoked. Or sun-dried, and can keep for years.
Wow.
And, it's either kept for the Lamalerans themselves or traded off. And, so over the course of 2 days, this sort of mountain of meat, these, dozens of tons of meat, will be stripped down to the bone
just
and
with
divided.
Big flensing knives?
Yeah, just big knives.
Wow.
So dozens of people will be working on one whale.
Men and women?
The men will do the cutting, and the women will generally sort of do the processing once it's been broken down into steaks.
And there's children around as well?
It's a celebratory moment.
It's like the whole community is there for it.
Yeah.
Wow. It must be amazing to watch it sort of winnow down. And then when you're left with the bone structure, what happens? Any use for any of the bone material, or does most of the bones sit on the beach?
So a lot of the bones are used for sort of spiritual purposes. They're put into these shrines which honor the whales, and which honor the ancestors, and asks that the whales return.
Okay.
Sometimes parts of the bones, apparently they burn really hot. So they'll actually, if there's like a boulder or something that they want to break, they will pile bones on it and around it, and then set the bones on fire.
They must have remnant oil in them.
Yeah, once the bones are very dry. You can't, they seem to only do this with, quite old bones. You can see them just sort of baking on the beach and sun drying. And then once, they're sort of old and brittle, they'll just stack them around a boulder and just light them on fire. And I've seen this happen. I've seen them split a big rock doing this.
And then unique to the sperm whale is the spermaceti oil in its head, which I believe is part of its, like sonar apparatus, right? Because they are doing that clicking that you were talking about. That was the oil, that was the most prized of the whale oils when it was being used as machine lubricant and to light streets and lamps. What are they doing with spermaceti oil?
So they're still using it for lighting purposes, though to a lesser extent now that they have some access to electricity. They have a generator in the town which provides some electricity at night, though they don't have 24/7 electricity. But they also just use it for cooking. They use it for health purposes.
Topically as well as internally?
Yeah. A lot of the time they just drink it.
Yeah, cool. Okay. I've been real curious. How is that as a flavor?
It's pretty neutral.
Yeah, pretty mild.
Um,
It's such a beautiful oil. So
yeah,
clean looking.
it's
And for people who don't understand, so this is in that big bulbous
right.
head is just filled with what looks like to me, correct me if I'm wrong, like an oil that doesn't need to be rendered or processed. Like
No,
it's
it
just a
just
beautiful,
comes
clean
out.
oil, right?
There's
Can't think of an equivalent in nature where anything is like that.
yeah. I don't know the anatomical structure that holds it very well. There's just it's called the spermaceti well, and I don't know if that's a sac or if that's exactly what that is.
Yeah, because when you see the skull of the sperm whale, you see like a concavity where that sits above, but there is no like bone structure that's holding that.
I think it's just cartilage or blubber.
Wow.
But once it's hit, it's like hitting oil or like hitting oil in Texas or something. You know, it just comes out.
Wow.
So once you puncture it, they will literally just basically put buckets to get the easy stuff out, and then they'll sort of saw through the rest of it, you know, to get the stuff that doesn't just well out on its own.
And what becomes of the subcutaneous fat, all the blubber that's on the body?
They eat it and render it, and
so they do render some of that. So you kind of create like a whale lard out of it. Mm-hmm. Okay, and then the meat. How is that to eat? I'm curious. It's not like you had a Michelin 3-star cuisine out of it, but flavor wise, what is it like?
It's sort of like a fishy beef.
Okay.
It's a red meat. They're mammals.
Do they make that distinction of marine mammals versus fishes?
No, they call any in their everything is ika, which is fish. Okay. So and all marine animals are fish, and all land animals are. I don't even know if there's a specific category for the land animals.
Okay. So kind of fishy. Does it have, I eat a lot of venison, and I didn't used to realize that beef had a very distinct flavor, because it was to me the taste of red meat. Now when I revisit beef, it's like, oh, there's a real strong and distinctive flavor. I notice it with bear too. There's a flavor that I can say that's definitely bear meat, even though it's quite mild. Is there a flavor that you could definitely pick it out?
It's strong.
It's distinctive.
And it has it has a very unique texture too, because it has these sort of vascular, I don't know exactly what they are, but sort of vascular tubes or something that sort of thread.
Like
very
small. Or something. Oh,
yeah,
wow.
but that's threaded through all the meat.
And what parts of that animal are the most prized pieces?
There's not like particular cuts.
There's it's just all.
It all gets all the meat that's not the soft internal organs that go into a stew the first day. Just these giant cauldrons of whale flesh are basically turned into jerky. So I think the distinction between the tail meat and the the flipper meat is not big.
Have you seen pregnant females come in?
They try to avoid they try to avoid ones that are very obviously pregnant.
Oh, okay.
They have occasionally hit ones that are pregnant unintentionally, and they're more than willing to take young whales.
Yeah.
But generally given the choice between one or the other.
Okay. And that meat that you described as jerky, one of the things that really fascinated me was like it seems like it gets cut into fungible units, like equal sized 6-inch strips that can be traded and have a sort of equivalent value between them, right?
Yeah. So they get cut into what's called the farang, which is a half foot strip, which is sort of the basic unit of currency in the barter economy.
That's really interesting. Well, you mentioned about the eyes of the folks who do this. So over time, like, just I guess briefly, like, what are the real common occupational injuries from the chronic stuff? Like, what happens to their eyes, and then I guess in the short term, what kind of injuries are common in this hunt?
So they're out there, 6 days a week, just staring at the sun off the ocean, looking for animals swimming out there. So they almost all develop cataracts.
Wow.
by the time they're in their late 50s.
And that's the crews on the boats.
The crews on the boats, which is basically all the working men.
Okay. And by what age did you say?
Probably their late 50s. I would say that almost everyone's.
Do they have any medical care for that, or do they just slowly lose their eyesight?
It's not. They don't go blind, but they lose it to the point where they're not as effective anymore.
Okay.
And that is almost a universal ender of people's careers.
Okay.
At that point they might become a shipwright or doing things on shore or a rower, but the men are generally extremely fit.
Yeah.
So it's not, there are harpooners who've worked into their 60s, who have been, extraordinarily good. But in general, one of the limitations of their way of life, and they all have sunglasses and other things now.
Okay, they do, yeah.
They know what those are.
Yeah.
But has been the loss of sight.
Okay, injuries to their limbs or anything like that?
Yeah, people will lose. Often, what happens is a rope will get wrapped around an arm or a leg during a fight, and it will basically, cut it right down to the bone.
Wow.
At which point the whole limb needs to come off.
Yeah. Wow. My goodness, tell us what's happening to their way of life now, and you. It seems like, as a spectator reading your book, like that you were there at a kind of a pivotal time. I mean, over the course of the book, quite a bit of change happens to their culture. And as it ends, you're sort of left wondering, like, I've thought for a long time about, in my lifetime, will the last traditional cultures sort of blink out of their, at least living their traditional life way? Will that end in our lifetime? And if so, to me, it seems like that might be one of the biggest moments in human history, sort of like maybe the beginning of agriculture or sort of like going to the moon. It's like this is our traditional life way and has been for 300,000 years that we've been a species and back before us. And it's wrapping up right now, right? So sometimes I think like the Neolithic revolution, the agricultural revolution, isn't really complete yet because there are still people who aren't doing it yet. Yeah. But over the course of the book, you sort of see this could be winding down, and then you also feel the pressure from outsiders for everything from, oh my God, they hunt whales, to it's now illegal to kill the manta rays for them, right? Or so there's the conservation side, there's the politics, there's you write about a fish processing plant and obviously a cash economy. So like sort of what's happening there and what does it look like, over the next decade?
Yeah. Well, so I was there during a very exceptional time. They were still sailing, still choosing to sail with palm leaf sails really until almost 2010, and I first arrived there slightly after that. And then
and those look like a patchwork of sort of equal-sized squares.
Beautiful.
Are they processing them into a fiber and then weaving that, or is that actually cut pieces of?
It's just they basically dry the palm leaf and slice it into threads. It's the sails are quite beautiful. But, so for really since the early 1900s, post, 1922, they've known very well what's in the outside world. By no means were they ignorant of it, but they have chosen really up through the early 2000s that they wanted to not change very much about their way of life. They accepted Catholicism and some parts of Christianity, but for the most part, they kept the hunting traditions unchanged. It's incredible to go back and read anthropological accounts from the late 1970s or early 1980s when an Oxford anthropologist first went there. And even today, things are very, very little changed. But as you mentioned, when I was there, an improved road was finished to their town. They got a cell phone tower. They increasingly were understanding the importance of cash. So during the off season, during the monsoon season, when it's harder to hunt, lots of young men were going out and working construction jobs and so on and so forth in nearby towns where they could get money. And so the moment that I was really chronicling is one of them making a very important choice for their culture. You know, what are we going to keep? What are we going to lose? And how are we going to do that when the whole world, you know, both intentionally wants us to stop whaling for conservation efforts and so on and so forth, and just because the system that it's of capitalism and of industrial civilization is destroying the natural world that we rely on. And so that's, you know, that choice, whether we're going to keep committing to the ancient ways or sort of give in to the new ways, I think was really represented by John, that young man who I mentioned at the beginning, who wants to become a Lamafa, who is an apprentice, who, you know, was going to train up and become a harpooner and represent, you know, those old ways of life. On the one hand, he wanted to become a Lamafa, but he also knew what was out there. He also knew about, you know, Indonesia's modern cities, where anything that you could find in America is more than readily available then. And he was very curious about, you know, what would it like to be not risking my life, you know, doing backbreaking, dangerous work every day, and living, you know, these life he would see on a TV, which just seemed glamorous and easy. And so especially after he got hurt, and it wasn't clear whether or not he was going to be able to continue hunting, he was very drawn to that. And so the choice about modernity versus, you know, these ancient ways of living was very much embodied in his choice to eventually commit himself to a life in Lamalera and following these ancient ways. And as you mentioned, that's not a choice a lot of people are making. Most of these groups are being wiped out, both voluntarily and involuntarily. At the dawn of history, all humans were hunter-gatherers. All of our ancestors started with a lifestyle similar to the Lamalerans. You know, they might have been hunting different animals than whales, but the structures were very similar, the societal structures. Really, even until at the beginning of colonialism, 500 years ago, about a third of the world was still hunter-gatherers. Agriculture hadn't even gotten there. Now we're down to, you know, several thousand groups. If that, that would be a very generous estimate. The UN estimates that there are about 370 million people living what are termed quote-unquote traditional lifestyles, which could be both foraging and hunting and gathering, or Swidden agriculture, or herding. That still exist in the world. And they all face the same challenges that the Lamalerans do, which is that, you know, their ways of life are being overwhelmed and undermined, and that almost always means, you know, damage to these traditional people's health, their sense of being, and so
that's one of the interesting things is when you see indigenous groups who make that radical jump in one generation to, say, like a Western diet, it has just tremendous negative health outcomes, much more dramatic than you'd see, you know, in our own culture very often. And then I imagine the other big piece is attrition, right? Just young people leaving.
Yeah. And those young people who leave, as happened to many of the Lamalerans who have left, you know, they don't have a whole lot of modern skills. Yeah. They end up in the worst jobs, worst manual labor jobs that are available in developing countries. So
you paint a picture of I don't want to give too much of it away, but you describe sort of that glamorous appearance of seeing what's on TV and in films and thinking, oh, that's what it's like out there, and then the going out and experiencing it and seeing how, you know, difficult it can be to try to work your way. You know, I think most of us growing up with television understand, like, that's not real, or that's very few people's lives. And then as you get older, you understand that the people living those glamorous lives are actually working very hard and are very stressed out, and those aren't easy lifestyles. But you don't see, you know, if you've just seen it, how would you know? It's almost like a childlike approach to it, you know? So I just can't, I mean, I imagine it's quite a culture shock, but it wouldn't even do justice to it. But it must be quite shocking to get out there and live it.
I think it is shocking for a lot of them. They'll end up working on palm oil plantations or as, the equivalent of extremely underpaid janitors or maids or, on a factory line. And in doing so, many of them will come to realize that there were really important and good things about life in Lamalera. It's a bit of a stereotype, but hunter-gatherers were called the original affluent society by anthropologists in the 60s and 70s. And there were good reasons for that. Research shows that many hunter-gatherers work about 20 hours a week. They have significantly closer social bonds than people in industrialized societies. That's what happens when you have to work communally to get your food, and when you also share all your possessions, you're much more part of the group. Hunter-gatherers don't feel lonely in the same way that we do, nor do they have many of the mental illnesses nor physical illnesses because they're much more...
Yeah, much less cancer, less diabetes, less heart disease.
Almost everything. And the mental health statistics are even more impressive. It's hard to measure depression and other things that are culturally influenced across cultures, but essentially all anthropologists would agree that that the general statement, hunter-gatherers are happier on average than industrial citizens would be true. Now, that's not to say that there aren't great disadvantages to living in this way. The hunter-gatherers leave these societies for reasons. They have much higher infant mortality rates. They're materially much poorer. But what is, I think, so heroic about the Lamalerans, and what I was really trying to capture in telling their stories, was how they're trying to negotiate those challenges and to capture both the good things about the modern world and meld them with the good things about their original society. And I think that the fact that they're conscious of these things and that they're striving to control the process is a very unique thing in the world. Not many groups are able to do it with such open eyes.
What allows this group in particular to do that?
Several things. So as I mentioned before, they've had a decent idea for decades of what's out there.
Have they had like sort of a controlled flow through their remoteness or something?
Well, so both A, they're remote, and B, they don't need, like other hunter-gatherers, a huge piece of land to sort of roam around on, right?
Right, yeah.
They just need their tiny little town.
Okay, because when you look at North America, like for instance with the reservation system, you have people who are used to roaming a tremendous tract of land, and their annual migration suddenly move to usually a piece of land that they didn't consider to be particularly productive.
It would be impossible for most hunter-gatherer societies to exist today just because the ecological resources do not exist for them. Yeah. That's not true for the Lamalerans.
So interesting.
They have been able to continue to exist, and they should be able to continue to exist in the future. However, there's also just, this consciousness of it's a choice that they're making. It's that every year they're going to get together and they're going to make the rules for this year. We're going to choose how we want to engage with this outside world. So there are actually sort of a doppelganger. There's a doppelganger tribe to the Lamalerans called the Lamalerans, which came from sort of the same historical lineage as them, also hunted whales, and live on the other side of the strait from them. And the Lamalerans gave up whaling about a generation ago.
Oh, wow.
And they, for various reasons, decided that it wasn't worth it. The Lamalerans decided that it was, and have been very consciously fighting to keep it. And having seen what has happened to the Lamalerans versus what has happened to the Lamalerans, I think the Lamalerans feel that they made the right choice.
Wow, yeah.
And that they have a much stronger culture, that they have much stronger cultural cohesion and group identity, and just are healthier.
Yeah.
Have a better. They may not be as materially as rich, but in the long run, they feel that they're doing better.
Yeah. How in touch have you been able to be with the people that you made strong connections with there? I know that they've now have access to phones and Facebook and things like that. So are you able to stay in contact and maintain those relationships with any of them?
I am, and it's been a wonderful thing to go from being a journalist to being a friend.
Yeah.
There's certain boundaries that you
Yeah.
have to maintain as a journalist, and
Yeah.
it's been wonderful to be able to explore this new type of relationship. I remember when I first went there, and even really up through 2014, 2015, it was extraordinarily hard to keep in touch with them when I was outside of Lamalera, just because the cell phone service was so bad and so on and so forth. And it's still terrible, but it's possible to keep in sort of weekly, if I send them a message, I know that at some point in the week, someone will be able to get a cell phone signal somewhere and send something back.
Okay. Yeah, it's really fascinating. And then I guess, sometimes I ask scientists questions about what they personally think or feel about a topic, and they're often reluctant to speculate because of their work. And you did an exceptional job throughout the book of remaining sort of like keeping yourself out of the narrative, and such that you feel as a reader like a fly on the wall there. It doesn't feel like we're getting Doug's experience of this. We're just getting your reporting, I guess. Are you willing to sort of say like what you hope happens? Because again, you don't conclude with like, here's my concluding thoughts about what I think they should do. But obviously, I'm sure you've thought about it, and there's, I'll add one more piece, which is there's that part of me that wishes that the remaining intact hunting and gathering cultures and traditional cultures could stay that way. And then I've had folks tell me like, hey, that's a little bit racist in a sense. Like, do you think that you should dictate what they're, if they want to come out and join the modern world, then like that's like they make that decision sovereignly. And so, I would add that to it too. Like, it can be a little bit like emotionally uncomfortable from the outside to watch people give that up. And I guess it's that sense of like, no, I'm telling you, it sucks out here. Like, don't do it. Like in your conversations with folks there or in your inner workings, like what do you hope for to happen?
I hope that they get to make their own choice.
Mm-hmm.
They have been moving more towards embracing certain parts of the modern world. And I think that as I've noted before, they're trying to accept the things that they see are good.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that the most important thing is that they can do that, but they can also keep the things that they feel are good about their own way of life. All human beings should have the right to determine their own destiny.
Yeah.
And I think that what can go wrong is that we think we know better than these groups how they should live. Most of the remaining uncontacted hunter-gatherer groups are not unaware of what's happening outside. They have chosen to actively not participate in it, whether that's Amazonian groups or the few groups in Papua New Guinea or elsewhere in the world. This is an active choice, and we as citizens with greater power also have greater responsibility to leave their lands and their resources alone for them and to let them choose how they want to live. So I hope that the Lamalerans will get to do that, and I actually have a great deal of hope in their ability to face the challenges of the modern world. I've gotten to see them do it, and I've seen what wonderful and brave and smart people they are.
Wow, that's fantastic, and that same kind of hopefulness. The book ends and you feel that hopefulness, and that's unusual in these kinds of stories. And so I appreciate that. Where do you like people to get your book?
Oh, it's available anywhere. All bookstores, Amazon. There's a indiebound.org is a nice, or .com is an independent booksellers association website, which is always nice to help out your local bookstore. But it's available wherever books are sold.
And then lastly, because you do writing on other topics as well, where do people kind of, if they're interested in seeing more of your articles?
So I have a website. It's my name, just www.dougbockclark.com. I am not particularly active on social media. I'm just traveling and sort of off the grid too much to be able to keep up with it.
That's great.
But I have a newsletter, and I write regularly for The New Yorker and other places, so people should keep an eye out for it.
And last thing I want to say, your book is so beautifully written, and in another interview I listened to with you recently, heard you talking about sort of a background in Shakespeare, and then it clicked for me because it's so poetic. And while I read it, I thought, like, I was very lit up by it, and I thought, like, did you have editors fight you on the writing, or I'm just, because it's so beautifully done that I can picture editors being like, you got to tone it down, you got to write to the lower common denominator. Do they just let you be free on the page like this, and did you have to fight for that?
They made it better. They made it more beautiful.
Really? Yeah.
I feel very lucky for my editors, who are also exceptional writers and exceptionally.
But the publisher, was okay with this style of writing, because I mean it's unusual today, to at least in the genres that I read. I mean, it was just so nice to feel like somebody was writing to the level that I would want to read at, And for the people listening, I just can't recommend this book enough. I mean, it is fantastically written. It's quite an adventure. And for the kind of topics we talk about here, I mean, it's an intersection of several of them. So just bravo on the book, and thanks for taking some time to sit with us today.
Well, thanks for reading, and thanks for chatting with me about it.
Thanks for listening to the WildFed Podcast. You can help us grow this show by subscribing and leaving us a rating and review. It ensures better rankings and more advertiser interest, which translates directly into better shows, more awesome guests, and a constant stream of fresh, new content. Have a question you'd like answered on the show, or a hunting, fishing, or foraging trip you'd like to host us on? Email us at info@wild-fed.com. And be sure to visit our website, wild-fed.com, to check out the WildFed video show and store. WildFed. Food is all around you.